Running in the woods. Running has always been my refuge. The steady pounding of my feet on the ground, the steady breathing, it's my escape from the chaos of life. For years, I have maintained the same routine, a light dinner followed by a dusk run. My route is familiar, so familiar, in fact, that I can follow it in my sleep. The first half mile is along a neighborhood sidewalk bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Then the path leads me into the woods. For fear, the sidewalk ends, and a dirt road takes over, winding through dense trees for another 2 miles. It's the kind of place where you feel alone, but in a good way, a rare corner of solitude in a noisy world. The trail I prefer is unpaved, rougher, and less traveled. It was beautiful, especially during the golden hour when the sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating long, dappled shadows. I relished those peaceful moments, the only sounds being the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. The paved path was my way back, a quicker, easier way to get home as the light faded. But tonight was different. I had just reached the edge of the woods when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was unusual. I had never received a text message while running. I dismissed it as a bug, perhaps random spam, and continued. The air in the woods was cooler, and I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of my run, the events of the day passing by. That was when I heard a rustling sound, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like something moving through the underbrush. And I glanced around but saw nothing. Animals, I thought. Just a squirrel or maybe a rabbit. I picked up my pace. Then the sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable chime of another notification. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a text. The sound was clear, an airdrop notification. Someone nearby had just sent me some. My blood ran cold. No one should be close enough to do that, not here. The trail was remote, hidden, known only to a handful of locals. I forced myself to keep running, pretending not to notice, but my mind was racing. After a few seconds, I slowed down, pretending to need to adjust the music. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and opened the notification. My stomach dropped. It was a photo of me. It was taken from behind, mid-length, my silhouette unmistakable in the clothes I was wearing. The caption simply said, "Back." The photo had been taken seconds ago. My eyes darted around, trying to find the photographer, but all I saw were trees and dark. Panic surged through me. I shoved my phone back into my pocket and ran, faster than I had ever run before. I knew the woods, every twist and turn of the trail, but in my haste, the familiar path seemed foreign. The rustling behind me grew louder, now accompanied by footsteps. Someone was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to lose a second. As I neared the edge of the woods, I veered off the trail, cutting through the underbrush, hoping to lose whoever was behind me. The branches tore at my clothes and scratched at my skin, but I didn't stop. I could hear heavy breathing now, not mine, but someone else's, close enough to make me jump in horror. I dashed out of the woods, onto the quiet suburban street, and sprinted toward the nearest house. I didn't stop until I was pounding on their door, panting and scared. They opened the door, and I stumbled inside, gasping for air. I explained what had happened as they called the police, but when they arrived, there was no sign of anyone in the woods. I never found out who it was or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never run down that trail again. The woods, once my refuge, had become the place of nightmares. I turned off the airdrop feature on my phone that night, and I haven't run since. Story 2. The Terrible Rest Stop. my brother-in-law, and I have always shared a love of road trips, the open road providing a sense of freedom and adventure we couldn't find anywhere else. This time, we set out to drive across the country, from the lush forests of the East Coast to the arid deserts of the Southwest. The vastness of the landscape, especially in the remote areas of New Mexico, was both awe-inspiring and isolating. The highways seemed to stretch on forever, cutting through miles of barren land with little sign of life. As night fell, the sense of isolation deepened. There were no streetlights, only the dim glow of headlights cutting through the darkness. By midnight, we were both exhausted, our 4-hour drive having taken its toll. We agreed to stop at the next rest stop to get some sleep. But in this desolate part of the country, rest stops were few and far between. It took another hour of driving before we saw a rest stop sign. Relieved, we got out of the car, tires crunching on gravel as we pulled into the parking lot. The rest stop was as strange as ever, a small, nondescript building standing alone in the middle of nowhere. The only other car in the lot was an old, beat-up car parked near the entrance. The windows were dark, and it looked abandoned. The dim lights of the rest stop flickered as we stepped out of the car, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional breeze. We approached the building, intending to use the restroom before settling in for the night. When we reached for the doorknobs to enter, we found them locked. Odd rest stops, especially in the middle of nowhere, are usually open 24/7. I cupped my hand against the glass to peer inside, trying to see if there was any sign indicating why it was closed. That's when I saw it. A bright red stain on a door in the back, unmistakable even in the dim light. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. The blood was fresh, vivid against the drab interior of the rest stop. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back, my mind racing. My brother-in-law noticed the change in my expression and looked over, his face pale at the sight of the blood. We needed to get out of there. As we turned away, something else caught my eye. The car parked outside. It had no license plate, its body covered in dents and scratches. In the back window, there was an empty gun rack. My stomach clenched. Whoever had driven that car was probably still there, and the blood inside the rest stop suggested they weren't up to anything good. We hurried back to the car, the sense of urgency now overwhelming. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the rest stop and saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to the building was slowly opening. We couldn't see who or what was behind it, but the movement alone was enough to send us into a panic. I hit the gas, pulling out of the parking lot, gravel flying in my wake. As we sped down the freeway, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the other car chasing us. But the road behind us was still deserted, the darkness swallowing everything. It wasn't until we were miles away that we finally got a cell phone signal. We immediately called the police, our voices shaking as we reported what we'd seen. A few days later, after the tension of that night had subsided, I called the sheriff's department in the county where the rest stop was located, hoping for some result. I wanted to know what had happened, if they had found anything, but the police on the other end of the line seemed confused. They searched their records and promised to call me back, but the call never came. To this day, I have no idea what happened at that rest stop or who was behind that door, but the memory of that bloodstain, the empty gun rack, and the creaking door still haunts me. The vast emptiness of the desert, once a symbol of freedom, now feels like a place where anything could happen and no one would know. Story 3. The Man at the Door. Living alone has its perks. peace, quiet, and the freedom to do what you please without worrying about anyone else's schedule. But with that solitude comes a sense of vulnerability, especially at night. My house is in a quiet neighborhood where the only sounds at night are the rustling of leaves and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. I have my own dog, a small but loyal terrier mix named Max. Despite his size, Max has a bark that makes anyone think twice before approaching the house. It was around midnight, and I was going through my usual bedtime routine. As usual, I let Max out for a final bathroom break before bed. The night air was cool, and the neighborhood was quiet. I watched Max run off into the darkness, his little tail wagging happily. I closed and locked the front door, trusting that he would return in a few minutes after he finished his nightly patrol of the yard. I went upstairs to get ready for bed, brushing my teeth and changing into pajamas. As I was returning downstairs to let Max in, I heard the familiar scratching sound on the door, his usual signal that he was ready to come back inside. But as I reached for the doorknob, a strange sense of unease washed over me. Without thinking, I leaned forward and peered through the peephole. My heart nearly stopped. Instead of Max, there was a man standing on my porch. He was facing the door, his head down so I couldn't see his face, but his posture was tense, almost predatory. His hand was on the door, making a scratching sound that I mistook for my dog. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what he was doing. He was mimicking Max's behavior to entice me to open the door. I froze, my eyes glued to the peephole. The man's movements were slow and deliberate, his fingers sliding across the wood of the door. He must have realized that I hadn't opened the door yet because the scratching became more insistent, louder, as if he were trying to provoke a reaction from me. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, but I couldn't take my eyes off the peephole. Then, as if sensing that his trick wasn't working, the man slowly raised his head. The porch light cast deep shadows on his face, making his expression unreadable, but the glint of metal in his hand was unmistakable. He was holding a knife, and without hesitation he began to stab it into the lock, trying to open it. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. At that moment, Max, who was somewhere in the yard, finally realized something was wrong. His deep, ferocious bark rang out, echoing through the quiet night. The man stopped, startled by the sudden noise. He glanced around, trying to locate the source of the bark, but the darkness and ferocity of Max's bark must have unnerved him. He turned and ran away, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened before I finally acted. I unlocked the door just enough to let Max in, then slammed it shut and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking so much that it took several tries to lock the door. I ran to the window, peered out into the darkness, but the man was gone. All that was left was the silence of the night and my pounding heart. I didn't sleep that night, my mind replaying the events over and over again. The next morning, I filed a police report, but without a clear description of the man, there wasn't much they could do. Weeks passed, and while the immediate fear subsided, the sense of vulnerability remained. I installed a security system, and eventually I moved to a new house, one with fewer hiding places and a shorter distance from the front door to the street. But no matter where I lived, I couldn't shake the habit of checking the peephole before opening the door. Because now I knew, sometimes the person on the other side isn't who you think,